Ladies and gentlemen, this is Scary Bad Reviews, and this is my intro. So, it is October 18th. As I told you guys earlier in the week, I was going to be doing a double header tonight to kind of make up for some movies that I missed in the past. On top of the fact that I'm doing a double header today, I have a single movie planned for Sunday and a double header planned for Monday. I am going to be out of town over the next 2 days, so I'll be away from my recording setup and those kind of things. But like I said before, I do plan on making these movies up to you guys in the days that I can't record. So Monday will be a doubleheader, and there'll be a couple more down the line. But today's, or rather tonight's doubleheader, I went back and watched two 50s B movies, and I mean they are B movies to a T. I watched the 1958 rendition of The Blob and the 1954 B movie Them. So starting off with The Blob, really starting off with both of these movies, and I've had this conversation now with a couple different people. It's very difficult to really sit down and review a lot of movies that came out before a certain time. And a lot of times I kind of round that off to like 65, maybe 1970. It's very difficult to review movies that came out before then because movie production companies had a different set of standards. There are definitely still bad movies that get made and get watched, but it seems like, I don't know, I think especially within horror movies, there was not a standard set yet, and they didn't know how far they could push the limits to scare people, what would scare people, I don't know, the vision of the industry that's super dominant on special effects. It was a tough time. I mean, it's very difficult for me to go back and review these movies because a lot of times the movies move incredibly slow, and most of them are not very good compared to anything that comes out nowadays. And so I try to do my best to not necessarily demote every single one of these movies, or to hold any of these movies that I think are successful to a higher standard than current movies. I think that wouldn't be fair. But starting off with The Blob, I felt kind of bad because I gave this movie a 3.5 because it was super difficult to watch. It seems to move super slow, almost like The Blob in the movie. There's not a whole lot to it. It's really just some teenagers trying to convince the rest of the town that this alien landed and is just spreading around, and it's literally just a blob. I mean, we don't get... The blob itself just kind of looks like not even goop or sludge or anything. It just looks like this liquid type deal. It really doesn't look even like a cool form of blob. I mean, we don't really get to see it interact on camera with a lot of stuff until almost the very end of the movie. We don't really get a sense of what it actually is. The characters in the movie are just super standard teenagers. We don't get a group dynamic. We don't get any form of background on any of these people. We just know that it's like a mid to high middle class society where these people just have an alien crash land nearby and just start spreading all over the place. They don't know what to do with themselves. So there's really not a whole lot to this movie. And that's kind of the difficult part of it, is that there's not very much to keep your attention in it. And I hate to be brutally honest, because this may have been, people may have looked at this differently back in the 50s, but watching it now, it's difficult to sit all the way through it and to keep your attention all the way through it. I mean, there's just nothing that happens in the movie. The movie is a lot of dead space where it's just people talking and trying to yell at each other and convince each other that, hey, this thing might actually be here. One thing that I do very vividly remember and want to talk about with this movie is there's the inclusion of the main girl in the movie. Her younger brother is who I'm guessing is the relationship between them. And every time this kid showed up on screen, which wasn't very often, but the 2 or 3 times that he does, I was immediately pissed off. This kid, no one taught this kid how to act. This kid literally came on screen and just started yelling whatever the hell he wanted to on screen. Like, to try to sneak out of her house, she says, "Oh, I'm going to buy you a puppy." This kid, who's supposed to be probably around like 7 or 8 years old, maybe a little bit older than that. I mean, he's just standing there listening to her, and she's like, "Oh, I'll buy you a puppy if you don't tell mom and dad on me." This kid just blatantly, at the top of his lungs, in the most like monotone yell, just goes, "I want to name it William." And like anytime this kid spoke, he sounded exactly like that. "Are you really gonna buy me a puppy?" And it fucking killed me. Like, it just drove me insane. As soon as I would see that kid on screen for a certain part of the movie, I'm like, ah shit, this isn't gonna be fun. Like, hearing that kid's voice caused me full on legitimate anger. Um, but like, there's not a whole lot about this movie that's discernibly bad or discernibly good. It's just that there's nothing to it. You really do. It seems like a very forgettable hour and a half because you can't really remember anything that happened in the movie other than this huge thing that kind of looks like glittery silly putty just kind of rolling around all over the place. Like that, there's nothing really in the movie that sticks out. So I think a 3.5, while I felt guilty about it and felt like it was me punishing it for coming out at a different time, I think a 3.5 is fair because even for it coming out back then, there's nothing to the movie. There really isn't. It was difficult to watch, and I understand how important it is, and that later on there was a remake of it that may have been a lot better, but this one definitely was not it for me. The other movie that I watched today was 1954's Them. Now, this movie was in the same kind of vein in that it's a 50s B movie. It's centered around monsters that are usually, kind of idealized around radiation or some kind of scientific mutation. This one was a lot better than the Blob. This one had actual moments that I could remember in it. There were certain aspects of the movie that I think did a really good job. I definitely think that there's still, areas to work on in writing and acting and all that kind of stuff, but there are a couple things in it that I do want to point out were pretty cool. The actual ants themselves, these giant ants that they're hunting out in the desert, for it being 1954, the ants don't look too bad. Like, I thought it was kind of cool seeing them come on screen. Now, you don't get very much direct interaction with them on screen and people on screen, but, I mean, the way that they looked in their scenes was actually pretty cool. I was very surprised at how nice those things looked. Also, another aspect of the ants that I found positive was the sound association with them. There's this just super high-pitched, piercing ringing that goes on within the movie whenever these things show up, and that's the ants' way of communicating with each other. But it's also, you start to grow it as a sound association so that in certain scenes, when you hear that sound and you haven't seen anything yet, you know the ants are coming and you know there's danger coming. Like I said, I definitely think that this one was a lot better than the Blob. I gave this one a 5.5 because there's still a lot of things in it that are not good. There's still not the greatest acting in the world. It still kind of moves at a slow pace at times. So while I think the ants actually looked a lot better than I expected, I still think that this movie would be difficult for a lot of people to watch. I actually had a lot of fun watching it, I will admit, and I do recommend it to people who are seasoned horror fans. I think that they would see where the fun in the movie is. I think a lot of people who aren't used to horror movies and a lot of people who don't watch a lot of movies would not want to sit all the way through this. But I definitely found the positives within it, and I think that both of these movies kind of shed light. The Blob not as much, but I think Them definitely sheds the light on the idea of why B movies kind of came about in Hollywood, and B movies that were especially centered around like monsters and stuff like that. Sometimes the monsters were of an alien race, and there was kind of an idea of xenophobia within the United States specifically within the Cold War. And so, like, we were afraid of something coming that was unknown to us that would ruin us. But an even bigger idea in Hollywood, and especially in horror movies in those 1950s B movies, was when these monsters were created by radiation. And the reason that they were so adamant about putting that into movies is that this was a time where we had just dropped the first A bomb, well, both A bombs within World War II, and there was this aspect of nuclear escalation between us and Russia during the Cold War. And so, playing into people's fears of a nuclear holocaust, of what radiation can do to people, of the dangers of nuclear energy, of nuclear weaponry, of mass destruction, was where these B movies were birthed. You know, people were honestly afraid of the effects of escalating nuclear, just possessions. I mean, what would happen if a nuke hit the United States of America? Like, what would happen to the people that survived? And so, having these monsters that were created by radiation and created by scientific experiments and stuff like that was really playing on the fear of the people at the time. I mean, people were living in fear during the Cold War, and especially of this idea of radiation and the effects that nuclear weaponry had on humans. And so I do think that while B movies are generally remembered for really bad monsters and really bad acting, and they're given the name B movies because they're not as good as a normal A-list movie, there definitely was a strong ideology behind it in saying, hey, while these movies may be really goofy and not look the greatest, the fear and the basis behind them is very real in the world today. So, that's my little tangent on 50s B movies, and that I think that they're smarter than they look. So thank you guys for listening again. Like I said, I'm really sorry, but there's not going to be a review tomorrow or Saturday. Sunday I'll be coming back. I'll be looking at An American Werewolf in London. Coming up over this next week, I'm going to start getting into some of the most notoriously awful monster movies. I have about 3 lined up that are notoriously known as the worst monsters and the worst monster movies. And then I'm going to be diving in for a good couple days into the OGs themselves, the Universal monsters. So stay tuned when it comes around to Sunday. I'll have American Werewolf in London is a great movie, and I'm going to love talking about it. Leave suggestions in the comments. And yet again, guys, thank you for listening.